Imagine being in a quiet town in Mexico in the dead of night. A van pulls up packed with 17 people. They've been traveling for days. No food, no water. Then they're told they owe $3,000 more each. But here's the twist. The driver isn't just a smuggler. He's a cartel operative. And if they can't pay, they vanish. No phone calls, no trace, just gone. This isn't fiction. This is 2026 in Mexico. What was once just a country migrants passed through, a border we argued over, has now become the final choke point in the American migrant crisis. And here's the shocking truth. That pressure valve is about to break. Why does this matter to you? Because when it does, it won't just be a migrant crisis anymore. It will be an explosion that ripples across borders, destabilizing everything. America's border, millions of desperate people, and billions in cartel profits. It's all at risk. But here's the part no one wants to admit. The breaking point is already here. And what happens next is something no one is prepared for. Stick with me because the truth is darker than you think. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. This isn't just about one van or one group of migrants. It's part of a pattern that's unfolding across the entire region. And this pattern, it's playing out right under our noses. In 2026, Mexico isn't just a border. It's the epicenter of a crisis that's been quietly building for years. And politicians, they're too busy celebrating temporary victories to notice the storm brewing. Here's the question that no one is asking. What happens when the last safety net, the last barrier breaks? What happens when Mexico can't hold back the flood anymore? Mexico is the last domino, the one that will tip the entire system into chaos. But what nobody's telling you is that this has already started. Think about it. For years, migration has been viewed as an American problem. But in reality, Mexico has become the stopgap, the one country holding the weight of migration policy. The U.S. and Mexico have shifted the burden onto each other, each claiming victory with statistics, but the crisis continues to grow. The truth, neither country can stop it. And they both know it. And that's where the pressure is building. If Mexico falls, so does the entire system. So what happens when this pressure finally breaks? The world doesn't just watch, it's pulled into the chaos, and it's already happening. In 2025, President Trump forced Mexico's hand. He threatened a 25% tariff on all goods, over $600 billion worth of trade. It was a massive leverage play. Mexico had no choice but to deploy 10,000 National Guard troops to the southern border. But here's the twist. The solution wasn't a solution at all. It was a temporary fix. Migrant encounters jumped 132% in just 1 year, but all it did was push the issue underground. Think about this. When you shut down legitimate pathways, you don't stop migration. You force it into the hands of criminals. In Mexico, cartels now control the flow of migrants. These aren't just smugglers. They're the ones setting the price, dictating who lives and who dies. The cartels don't need to hire smugglers anymore. They run the whole operation. A single cartel can pull in between $6 to $13 billion annually from human smuggling alone. Here's where it gets even darker. These aren't just numbers. These are real people. More than 73% of migrants surveyed by the United Nations in 2025 reported being victims of crime: kidnapping, robbery, extortion, even sexual violence. The numbers are staggering. And no one in Washington is talking about it. Instead, they celebrate low migrant numbers as if that means the problem's solved. But the reality is far worse than what anyone's willing to admit. Now, here's where the situation goes from bad to worse. What happens when you start building walls to stop migration? You don't stop it. You industrialize it. Every new mile of wall doesn't make it harder for cartels to move people. It makes their smuggling routes more valuable. The U.S. government just spent $3.3 billion to build a smarter wall, more cameras, more sensors, more barriers. They called it enhanced security. But what they didn't mention? They're creating a gold mine for cartels. The harder you make it to cross, the more people pay to get through. The cost to cross the border has skyrocketed from $1,500 in 2015 to $3,000 or more today. In high-risk areas, it can go as high as $15,000 per person. And it's not just the migrants who suffer. Between 2024 and 2025, migrant deaths along the border surged by 43%, according to the Government Accountability Office. Not because more people are crossing, but because because the routes are more dangerous. The wall doesn't stop migration, it makes it deadlier. Meanwhile, the cartels are raking in the profits. If 300,000 migrants crossed in 2025 at an average fee of $5,000, that's $1.5 billion in smuggling fees alone. And that doesn't even include the money made from kidnappings, ransom, and forced labor. So when Washington celebrates border security, they're really celebrating the cartel economy that's thriving as a result. And the more you militarize the border, the stronger the cartels get. This is where the entire system begins to break down. The pressure that's been building under the surface, it's about to explode. As more resources get funneled into border enforcement, the system becomes more complex, more chaotic. And here's the kicker. When governments try to manage migration by criminalizing it, they don't just create a barrier, they create a breeding ground for violence and corruption. It's like a pressure cooker. The more you try to contain it, the more violent the consequences become. And we've seen this before in places like Libya and Turkey. When a government outsources migration control to militias or criminal groups, the situation spirals out of control. That's exactly what's happening in Mexico right now. In the U.S., politicians love to talk about security measures. But what happens when those measures don't stop migration, but instead create a profitable black market for cartels? What happens when the entire system, security, migration enforcement, border patrol, becomes a tool for exploitation? What happens is this: Mexico becomes the last line of defense, and when that breaks, everything collapses. Cartels don't just control smuggling routes, they control entire regions. They've already infiltrated local governments, assassinated mayors, and taken over police forces. And when that happens, Mexico's government loses control. That's stage 4, the system shock. And we're closer than you think. Now let's zoom out for a moment, because what's happening in Mexico, it's not isolated. It's part of a bigger global pattern. And that's where things get even more unsettling. Take a look at Turkey during the Syrian refugee crisis. In 2015, when Syria collapsed, millions of refugees flooded into Turkey. The European Union was terrified of a migration surge, so they made a deal. Turkey would become the migration gatekeeper for Europe. They'd keep refugees on Turkish soil in exchange for billions of dollars. And for a while, it worked. But then something unexpected happened. In 2016, Turkish President Erdogan threatened to open the floodgates. If the EU didn't pay up, he would send millions of refugees into Europe. He didn't just manage the crisis, he weaponized it. Turkey didn't solve the problem, it monetized it. Fast forward to Mexico in 2026, and you'll see the exact same pattern. The cartels are no longer just smugglers. They're managing migration like a business. And just like Turkey, they've figured out how to leverage their control for political and economic gain. In Libya, after Gaddafi fell in 2011, migrants were trapped in a lawless corridor. The EU paid Libya to stop migrants, and militias took over. These weren't border guards. They were armed gangs running detention centers that were basically slave markets. The EU knew what was happening, but they kept funding it anyway. And the violence, it didn't stop. It got worse. Migration routes became more dangerous. Cartels adapted, raised their prices, and expanded their networks. When you outsource control to criminal groups, the system doesn't stabilize. It becomes more violent, more profitable, and harder to break. Mexico is now walking down that same path. The cartels are not just managing the flow, they're controlling it. And when they hold all the cards, the government becomes irrelevant. Now let's break down what's happening in Mexico today, because what's going on there isn't just about criminal organizations, it's about a systemic collapse that nobody in power is willing to face. In 2025, when President Trump pushed for stricter border controls, Mexico's response was to deploy more troops. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Those troops aren't stopping migration. They're managing it. They're not keeping cartels out. They're ensuring the flow of migrants stays under control, all while making sure the cartels still profit. President Claudia Sheinbaum inherited this mess in 2024 with a drastically reduced budget for migration enforcement. At the same time, she deployed 10,000 more National Guard troops. That money didn't just appear, it came from somewhere. And here's the kicker. The funds are being redirected, but not to stop the cartels. It's all about keeping the system running, even as it falls apart. Here's the real question. What happens when the Mexican government decides it's better to let the cartels manage migration than to fight them? Because that's exactly what's happening right now. Mexico can't afford to fight the cartels, so it's playing both sides. But here's the problem. This can't last. The cartels aren't partners, they're parasites. The more power they gain, the less control Mexico has over its own borders. Eventually, entire regions will fall under cartel control. And when that happens, it won't just be a Mexican crisis, it will be an American crisis too. We're already seeing it in places like Sinaloa, where cartels are fighting for territory, killing anyone who gets in their way. The violence is spilling over into the U.S., and as Mexico's borders collapse, so will the fragile agreements that have kept migration in check. This is where the situation takes a turn for the worse. We've seen this pattern before. History repeats itself, but with Mexico, the stakes are far higher. The U.S. has made the same mistake time and time again. It focuses on enforcement and ignores the root causes of migration. Take Guatemala, for example. In 2019, the Trump administration pressured the country into signing a safe third country agreement. The idea was simple. If migrants pass through Guatemala on their way to the U.S., they must apply for asylum there first. If they didn't, they'd be sent back. What happened? The system collapsed. Guatemala's asylum infrastructure was a joke. One office, 18 staff members, and millions of asylum seekers. In 3 months, the whole system broke down. And when it did, people didn't give up. They crossed into Mexico instead. But here's the key. The U.S. knew it would fail. They weren't trying to create a functional asylum system. They were just creating a barrier, a delay tactic. And while that did reduce the number of crossings temporarily, the problem didn't go away. It only got worse. By 2021, the border saw an explosion of migration, more than 2.1 million apprehensions in 1 year. And now, here we are with Mexico. The same patterns are repeating. The cartels are growing stronger, controlling migration routes, and making billions in the process. The U.S. and Mexico are stuck in a cycle where enforcement measures only make the problem worse. So, what does this mean for the future? It's simple. The system is heading towards collapse. The U.S. and Mexico are already on the brink, and all it takes is one misstep to send everything tumbling down. In 2025, when Trump's executive order terminated the CBP-1 app, it didn't just change the process for migrants, it pushed them into the hands of cartels. Over 1 million migrants who had scheduled appointments at ports of entry suddenly found those appointments voided. They didn't go home, they stayed in Mexico waiting. And with each passing day, their desperation grew. When you shut down legal routes, you don't stop migration. You force people into the underground economy, and that's exactly what's happening now. Migrants who once had a chance at asylum in the U.S. are stuck in Mexico with no way forward except through cartel-controlled routes. Here's the kicker. Mexico didn't just start seeing more migrants than the U.S. It's been happening for months. Mexican authorities reported more migrant encounters than the U.S. every single month between May 2024 and March 2025. But the U.S. celebrated these numbers as if the problem was solved. Meanwhile, those migrants didn't disappear. They're still stuck, waiting in limbo. And as they wait, they're becoming more vulnerable to the cartels, paying higher fees, and facing greater risks. Here's where things get really dangerous. We're only one court decision away from the system breaking. The U.S. is implementing harsher border restrictions, but the reality is far more complicated than anyone in power is willing to admit. In the wake of these enforcement measures, there's one thing that's clear. Cartels are adapting, and they're getting more creative. In 2025, after the arrest of Sinaloa cartel co-founder Ismael El Mayo Zambada, you'd think the cartel would weaken. But instead, the opposite happened. A power struggle erupted within the cartel, leading to over 600 deaths in Sinaloa alone. And while this chaos unfolded, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, seized the opportunity to expand its operations into 19 more Mexican states, taking control of key smuggling corridors. These corridors, once under the control of the Sinaloa cartel, are now firmly in the hands of new players. That means more violence, more competition, and more migrant deaths. Cartels don't just smuggle people, they control territories, they kill for power, and they profit off of human desperation. The violence is now spilling over the border into the U.S. The homicide rates in border cities like El Paso, Laredo, and Brownsville are higher than ever before. These aren't just numbers. These are lives lost, lives destroyed, all because cartels are fighting for control of the smuggling routes that migrants have no choice but to use. And the U.S. government, they're not addressing the real issue. They're celebrating enforcement numbers, but they're ignoring the fact that cartels are thriving in the chaos.